The man who buried Jesus was not one of his disciples. He was a member of the council that had sentenced him to death. And what he did that Friday afternoon was, by Roman law, nearly impossible to pull off. Under Roman custom, the body of a crucified criminal was not released to anyone. It stayed on the cross, sometimes for days. That was part of the punishment, to deny the executed even the dignity of burial, to leave the body as a public warning until there was nothing left worth burying. Pilate had no obligation to hand over the remains of a man his soldiers had just executed for sedition. No obligation, and every political reason to refuse. But Jewish law pulled in the opposite direction. Deuteronomy required that the body of an executed man be taken down and buried before sundown, the same day. To leave a body exposed overnight was to defile the land. And this particular Friday was not just any Friday. The Sabbath beginning at sundown was the Sabbath of Passover week, the most sacred day of the Jewish year. The clock was running. Jesus died around 3 in the afternoon. Sundown was roughly 3 hours away. The 12 disciples were behind locked doors. Into that gap walked 2 men no one would have predicted. Neither had ever publicly claimed to follow Jesus. Both sat on the Sanhedrin, the same court, 71 men, that had handed Jesus to Pilate to be killed. But here is what the records show. When that vote was taken, neither of them had cast it. One had refused to consent. The other, most scholars believe, was simply not in the room, whether they stayed away on purpose or arrived too late. The result was the same. 2 men on a court of 71 who did not raise their hand. They had said nothing publicly, done nothing visible. For the entire 3 years Jesus had taught in Jerusalem, they had kept their distance. And then, in the space of 3 hours on a Friday afternoon, they stepped out of it entirely. To claim the body, they would have to touch it, which made them ritually unclean under Jewish law, unable to participate in the Passover celebrations just hours away. To approach Pilate publicly meant their names would be attached to a man Rome had just executed for threatening the empire. Their seats on the Sanhedrin, their reputations, the positions they had spent careers building, all of it was now visible, on record, impossible to walk back. They knew this. They came anyway. And what they brought with them, the linen, the spices, the tomb, was not the burial of a disgraced criminal. It was the burial of a king. There is a line Isaiah wrote 700 years before that Friday. One line about how the servant would be buried, that his tomb would belong not to criminals, but to a rich man. That line was waiting for someone specific to fulfill it. The person who fulfilled it was not who anyone would have predicted. That story begins with a man most people have never heard of, and a decision he had been putting off for 3 years. He was one of the 71 men who made up the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of Jewish life, the body Rome dealt with when it needed the Jewish population managed. To sit on that council was to have spent a lifetime earning standing that could not be bought quickly. Joseph of Arimathea was one of them. Mark calls him boulut, the Greek word for a man whose counsel carries weight. Its root is boul, opinion, judgment, the word that settles arguments. He was, by the definition of his own title, built to speak, the kind of man a room waits for. He was also wealthy enough to own a tomb already cut from rock, not a grave dug in the ground, but a sealed chamber carved into stone, prepared in advance. In first-century Jerusalem, that was not a practical detail. It was a statement. Only families at the very top maintained private rock-cut tombs near the city. Joseph had one. He had built a life that put him in that category, and he had built it carefully. And in secret, without telling any of it to anyone, he believed Jesus was from God. John says it plainly. Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. Not a recent convert. He had watched the ministry from a distance for years, long enough to be convinced, not long enough to say so out loud. The belief was real. The silence around it was equally real. Here is the thing about that silence. It was not weakness. Cowards do not climb to the Sanhedrin. Joseph had looked at the cost of speaking and decided it was too high. The Sanhedrin had already issued a formal decree, recorded in John chapter 9, that anyone who confessed Jesus as the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. This was not a social inconvenience. Expulsion meant being cut off from the community, from worship, from the legal and commercial networks that ran through synagogue life. It came in degrees, the mildest lasting 30 days, the severest cutting a person off entirely. Treated the way a leper was treated. John notes elsewhere that, even among the rulers, many believed but would not say so. They loved, as he puts it, the approval of men more than the approval of God. Joseph was not the only one in that room carrying a secret. He was simply the one who had built the most to lose. His reputation, his seat on the council, the relationships he had spent decades building. To stand up publicly for a Galilean preacher, the high priest wanted removed. That was not a small thing. He had calculated, and he had stayed quiet. Then came the night the Sanhedrin voted to hand Jesus to Pilate. A hurried session convened at the high priest's house in the dark. Irregular by their own rules, but urgency overrode procedure. Joseph was either absent or present and silent. Both options have been debated by scholars for centuries. What is clear is that he did not raise his hand, but neither did he speak. William Barclay put it plainly. Think what it would have meant to Jesus in the room full of hostility if even one voice had spoken for him. Joseph was not that voice. He had everything required, the standing, the knowledge, the conviction. He had simply decided the moment had not yet arrived. That Friday afternoon, with Jesus dead and the sun 3 hours from setting, the moment arrived. Nicodemus was different from Joseph in one important way. He had tried, where Joseph had kept his belief entirely hidden. No record of approaching Jesus, no record of speaking up, nothing. Nicodemus had actually gone to him. He came at night, alone, with questions he could not ask in front of anyone else. The night visit was deliberate. During the day, Jesus moved through crowds with opponents watching his every word. There was no space for a real conversation. But nighttime was when serious men discussed Torah, when questions could be asked without an audience, without political consequence, without the performance that daylight required. Nicodemus chose the hour carefully. He was not hiding. He was seeking. And he was not an ordinary man. John calls him ho didaskalos tu Israel, the teacher of Israel, not one of many teachers, the one. The man whose role was to set the standard for what the nation understood about God and pass it down. He sat on the Sanhedrin. He was, by any measure his world recognized, a man whose opinion ended arguments. He came to Jesus and opened with this: "We know you are a teacher who has come from God." It is a careful sentence. He does not say he believes. He says we know, a plural that keeps distance between himself and his own conviction. Jesus does not answer the statement. He answers the question underneath it, the one Nicodemus had not yet said out loud. You must be born again. He was telling the man who set the standard for what an entire nation believed, that he had missed the most important part. Nicodemus leaves that conversation without resolution. The text does not record whether he believed that night. He goes back to his life, back to the council, back to quiet. The second time he appears, he is in the Sanhedrin chamber. The room is moving toward a decision about Jesus, and Nicodemus speaks. One line, framed as a procedural question. Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him? He does not defend Jesus. He defends the procedure. It is the most cautious possible form of objection, and it still costs him. The room turns immediately. Are you from Galilee too? To understand how that landed, you have to understand what the Pharisees of Jerusalem thought of Galilee. The northern region was considered contaminated. Too much contact with Gentile neighbors, too rural, too far from the centers of Torah learning. The Pharisees had a specific phrase for people they considered beneath them: Am Haaretz, the people of the land. Rabbi Hillel, the most respected teacher of the generation before Jesus, said plainly, no member of the common people is pious. Galilee was, in Jerusalem's estimation, where the common people came from. To tell Nicodemus, the teacher of Israel, a man who had spent his entire life at the apex of Jewish scholarship, that he sounded like he was from Galilee was to strip him of everything his career had built, in one sentence. They could not answer his legal argument, so they attacked the man making it. And they were wrong factually. Jonah had come from Galilee, so most scholars believe had Elijah, but they were too angry to remember. Nicodemus says nothing more. That is the last record of him speaking in public. So here are the two men who will step forward on Friday afternoon. Joseph, whose silence had never been tested, never broken, never failed. And Nicodemus, who had tried once, offered one careful line, and been publicly humiliated for it, who had learned, in the most direct way possible, exactly what speaking up cost. Two kinds of silence, the same result. And then the cross. It is now Friday afternoon. Jesus died around 3. Sundown, and with it, the Sabbath of Passover week, is roughly 3 hours away. The 12 are behind locked doors, and Joseph of Arimathea is walking toward the Praetorium, the residence of Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea. What he is about to do requires understanding something about how Roman execution worked. When Rome crucified someone, the body did not automatically go to the family. It belonged to Rome. Pilate had no legal obligation to release it to anyone. And, in the case of a man executed for sedition, every political reason to refuse. Releasing the body of a convicted insurgent to a sympathizer was the kind of decision that could look bad in a report to the emperor. Pilate was already walking a tightrope with Jerusalem's religious establishment. He had no reason to make this easier for anyone. Mark uses one word to describe what Joseph did next: tolmesis. It is Greek for dared, not went, not approached, dared. The word implies that what came before the action was fear, and that Joseph moved anyway. He walked in and asked for the body. Pilate was surprised, and the surprise was not ceremonial. Crucifixion was designed to kill slowly. Death came by asphyxiation, over hours, sometimes days, occasionally longer. A man lasting only 6 hours on the cross was unusual enough to raise questions. Pilate summoned the centurion in charge of the execution to confirm it before agreeing to anything. Joseph stood and waited. Yes, already dead. Pilate released the body. Here is what that moment cost Joseph, now that it was done. His name was on record with the Roman governor as someone who had claimed the body of a man executed for threatening the empire. Everyone who needed to know would know by morning which side he had chosen, where his loyalty ran. There was no version of this that let him return to his seat on the Sanhedrin and pretend the Friday afternoon had not happened. He had stepped out of the shadow he had maintained for years, completely and publicly, with no way back. At Golgotha, Nicodemus was waiting. He had not come empty-handed. He brought 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, and that number requires explanation. Jewish burial did not involve embalming. The body was washed, wrapped in linen, and layered with spices. What varied was the quantity. For an ordinary man, a modest amount. For someone of standing, more. When King Asa died, Scripture notes he was laid in a bed of spices, not because it was unusual, but because the quantity signaled who he was. A royal burial looked different from a common one. 75 pounds was not generous. It was royal. The specific weight, the specific mixture. It was a statement about who Nicodemus believed he was burying. Not a criminal, a king. And here is what makes this the most remarkable detail in the entire account. Nicodemus did not believe Jesus was going to rise. He had sat across from him in that nighttime conversation. He had heard things that pointed toward it. But a man who expects resurrection does not bring 75 pounds of burial spices. He came with everything required for someone who was permanently, finally gone. This was the most he could do for someone he believed he would never see again. And by doing it, by choosing that quantity, that honor, he completed a line Isaiah had written 700 years earlier. Isaiah 53, verse 9. His grave was assigned with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Wicked. Jesus died between two criminals. No one who loved him arranged that. Rich. He was buried in a rock-cut tomb belonging to one of the wealthiest men in Jerusalem, anointed with spices in a quantity fit for a king, purchased by another. Neither of them knew they were fulfilling a prophecy. They were not thinking about Isaiah. They were thinking about a body that had to come down before sundown, a burial that had to be completed with the hours they had left. They were thinking about someone they had loved quietly and from a distance, and what they could still do for him now. They took the body down, wrapped it in linen with the spices, carried it to the tomb, new, cut from rock, never used, and laid him inside. The stone rolled across the entrance. It was done. 2 men who had said nothing for 3 years had just done everything. What most people know about this story goes like this. Jesus had 12 disciples. They followed him, learned from him, built the church after him. That is the story. Those are the people. But the Gospels record who was actually there on the day that mattered most. And the list is not what anyone would have written in advance. The women from Galilee, John, the youngest, and 2 men from the council that had condemned him, moving through the last hours of a Friday afternoon with linen and spices and a tomb that did not belong to either of them. The 12 had every reason to be there, every preparation, every warning, every opportunity. They had heard him say it was coming. They had promised they would not run. Joseph and Nicodemus had none of that. No calling, no training, no promise made at a table the night before. What they had was belief carried privately for years, and the weight of everything they stood to lose by acting on it. Joseph was one of 71 men on the most powerful court in Jewish life. His reputation, his seat, his relationships inside that institution, all of it built over decades, all of it now on the line the moment he walked toward Pilate. Nicodemus was the teacher of Israel, the man the nation looked to for what was true and what was not. He had risked that once, offered one sentence in a hostile room, and been publicly humiliated for it. What they carried into that Friday afternoon was not courage in the ordinary sense. It was the weight of people who had already calculated the cost, already decided it was too high, and then found themselves moving anyway. Not because the fear was gone, because it had stopped being the largest thing in the room. Here is what that looks like, in case you recognize it. You have believed for a long time, genuinely. But there is always a reason the moment is not quite right. The people around you would not understand. The cost is real, and you have looked at it clearly. You are not hiding. You are just waiting for the version of this where it costs a little less. Joseph waited 3 years for that version. It did not come. What came instead was a Friday afternoon, and 3 hours, and a body still on a cross. Or you tried once, said something real, to your family, at work, somewhere that mattered, and they did not argue with you. They laughed or went quiet or changed the subject, in the way that tells you what you said was not worth taking seriously. And after that, without making a decision exactly, you stopped trying. Nicodemus said nothing after that, not until Golgotha. What shifted inside both of them on that Friday afternoon, Scripture does not say. No internal moment, no prayer, no conversation between them about what they were about to do. What the text gives us is the action. And one detail that is easy to overlook. Joseph had prepared that tomb for himself. It was his. The place he had arranged at considerable expense for his own burial. He gave it away to someone he had never publicly claimed to know. That is not a small thing to do in 3 hours. That is a man who has decided with finality that something matters more than his own future. Nicodemus brought enough spices to bury a king, for someone he did not expect to see again. When it was over, the prophecy was complete, not because the right people had shown up, but because 2 men who had loved quietly and waited too long finally ran out of time to keep waiting. And 700 years of Isaiah's words landed exactly where they were always going to land. The stone is across the entrance. The garden is quiet. 2 men are walking away with empty hands and nothing left to protect. They do not know yet what 3 days will bring. But the record shows this. The people who were supposed to be there were not. The people who were not supposed to be there were. And the thing that needed to happen happened anyway.